please stop talking about your shadow as if it's a single thing, because it's at least three different things. You've got shadow territories, shadow entities, and shadow behaviors, or at least that's the way that I conceptualize practical shadow work, rather than getting theoretically lost in some of the Carl Jung territory or considering the shadow to be an archetype. And you can read these books in your own time, but this is a beginner video, and I believe that the best beginner video should be deeply practical. So I've broken down the shadow into three definable categories: shadow territories, shadow entities, and shadow behaviors. We're going to break this down, we're going to form a foundation, and if you really want to get completely out of beginner hell and move straight into advanced territory, pick up a copy of Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson. Also pick up a copy of Meeting the Shadow essay collection by Connie Zweig and Jeremiah Abrams, and just move yourself out of this foundational space, because it's much more interesting to go to true depth rather than being stuck in the YouTube shallow, superficial, random journaling exercises here and there and getting all mystically inflated about integrating your shadow self. I can't even make a beginner video without, I can't pretend to be enchanted in the concept of shadow work. You can break it down, you can get granular, and if you do get precise with your conceptualization, you'll actually integrate your shadow self. I'm not going to give you a random assortment of 10 journaling exercises in this video. This is the first of 8 videos in a shadow work series, in the middle of a shadow work playlist to celebrate the launch of my shadow work library online course, which you can see promoted just over here. I've put 3 hours of this course available for free on YouTube. If this is your first time seeing me, I'm trying my best to make a beginner video, but if it does get too complex at times, just consider either getting the course or getting these books for yourself. Let's get into it nonetheless. How to integrate your shadow self. I want you to consider your shadow to not be one thing, but at the very least focus on your shadow behaviors, your shadow entities, and your shadow territories. Let's start with shadow behaviors, because this is fundamentally where most people tend to begin their shadow work. You're Googling how to do shadow integration or shadow work for beginners, because you notice that you've got certain crappy behaviors in your life. You're drinking too much, you're sleeping with the wrong kinds of people, you're avoiding your work, you're spending too much time in wasteful screen scrolling kind of states. You notice a shadow behavior, and you've heard the idea of shadow work, therefore you want to integrate whatever the secret mystery might be of the traumatic origins of your own dissociative, avoidant, escapist behaviors. Behavior being the key word. Very few people come into shadow work because they've contacted an archetypal entity or some particular form of maybe the maiden energy from a feminine perspective, or the magician or the warrior from a masculine perspective, or even a gender neutral perspective of the divine inner soulful component. Maybe you're on the mystical pathway, maybe you're archetypally blown open, and that's where you want to begin your shadow work. Usually it's shadow behaviors, so we'll start right at the absolute foundation. The shadow is the repressed, disowned, or otherwise rejected parts of our psyche, which are naturally formed through the human development process, from the beginning of ego formation into persona creation, and then through the very natural development of the human being. It's gonna happen. It's fundamentally going to happen. I'm not going to waste your time talking about what the shadow is and how the repressed parts then go off into the shadow and make it all dramatic. I want to give you something practical. The number one way to start working with your shadow is to look at your shadow behaviors, because the shadow behavior will give you the opening into the shadow entity. Shadow entities have shadow behaviors, and entities live in shadow territories. They're linked together. Again, the shadow, technically speaking, is all of the unconscious mind. It's all of the repressed potential. But if you start getting lost in that theory, if you start getting fascinated by the unconscious mind as a cognitive concept, you're getting further away from practical shadow work, which is fundamentally a fancy term for trauma healing, self-development, and some kind of academic leaning towards a jungian depth psychology perspective. It's just a term. What we're actually doing is we're looking at the places of us that feel like they're problematic. We're looking at the various behaviors and entities within us, the various subpersonalities, the various split-off parts that are causing some kind of problem. Because if you're honest with yourself, if you really want to get started with shadow work, you're not interested in this kind of study because you have a positive trait which is doing well for you. You're not Googling or YouTube searching how to do shadow work because you've got a really good work ethic, your life's put together, you're great on your sobriety, your relationship's doing fantastic, you've got a problem. We don't come to shadow work unless we've got a definable, painful problem, and that's usually a behavior, because even if we're focused on a problematic inner child who's having temper tantrums, or we're looking at the dark side of the lover energy, which is really promiscuous and can't commit to relationships, the way that you actually get the gateway into that shadow territory is through the symptomatic shadow behavior. So although technically speaking, you could look at the shadow territory, for example, the shadow territory of all romantic relationships, or all creative pursuits, all business endeavors, everything to do with fitness, anything to do with family, you've got territories which have various entities. For example, the romantic relationship, myself as a man, I'll have the boyfriend, I'll have the partner, I'll have the husband, I'll have the grandfather, I'll have all of these various entities of my potential shadow romantic psychic elements. They're enmeshed within that territory. The territory is the largest, most all-encompassing aspect of shadow work. The entity is the smaller, more manageable, more definable subpersonality or archetypal energy. And the behavior is the symptomatic, easy to grasp gateway into that entire process of unfolding, and hopefully that makes sense for you. I'm re-emphasizing the same point over and over again. If you just get one thing from this very foundational beginner shadow work video, shadow behaviors, shadow entities, and shadow territories, start with your shadow behaviors. It's something that I actually did inside the shadow work library over here. I've got my journal inside my course. I do a variety of practical exercises. We've got over 20 of them, and I also participate in some of them in real-time with you. So for example, for me, my shadow behaviors, and I go into this in much more detail inside the course, but my shadow behaviors are undereating, social seesaw, and bedtime rebellion. If you follow me on Instagram, I've been talking about my bedtime rebellion in particular detail, so I'm not going to go into my pretty messed up sleep schedule. But for example, undereating, one of my most obvious shadow behaviors right now is that although I am a 6 foot, 200, 201, 202 pound man, I've been training for over a decade, I need over 3,000 calories a day because I train quite frequently, I don't eat very much. I don't want to eat very much. My main shadow behavior, which comes up on a consistent daily basis, is not wanting to eat. It's very simple, and I could link over into the entities of the little boy or the spiritual self. I've got the old man. These are all my shadow entities in particular. Again, looking at my journal, I've got the entities of the feminine entities all together. They're in my shadow, all the way in the shadow territory. The old man, the little boy, I'm not yet an old man, I was a little boy, that's kind of distant. And I've got my spiritual self. That's making it too complex. The actual thing that's causing a problem for me, the actual repressed or disowned or problematic issue, is why do I not want to eat? And then you could practically say, well, what would it mean for you to eat consistently? And it's a whole exercise in itself. The important thing is, if you just want to get involved in this, you can list down your shadow behaviors, you can list down your shadow entities, you can tie them together, and then you can get mythic or poetic about the kind of territory that they live in. But it doesn't actually need to be complicated. If you want to integrate your shadow self, you need to look at your particular problematic behaviors, and they will lead you somewhere that I can't articulate on a video. You can't integrate your shadow by watching other people talking about shadow work. You need to actually do your own shadow work, which is why in my course I focus so heavily on practical journaling exercises, because even if I'm giving my example, you saw there, it's like, where did that example go? It dissipated, because I realized in the middle of sharing, what's the point of me sharing about my undereating pattern, or me sharing about my bedtime rebellion pattern, because there are going to be thousands of different people watching this video, yourself included, who have their own shadow behaviors, and I don't even want to impress upon you what my particular shadow behavior might mean, because my undereating might be linked to a preference towards being light and being energetically clear so I can stay focused and clean. I like fasting. It might also have a traumatic origin to some kind of unresolved childhood issue where I had stress and drama around eating. For example, my particular dinner time situations in my family home, just to share a bit of information with you, usually were quite anxiety making, quite stressful, and not very relaxing. Maybe there's a deep part of my nervous system which remembers that, But if I share all of that information with you, and I know I've just done it in this video, you might then think, oh, my undereating could also be linked to that particular thing from my childhood, or it could also be linked to my drive for cognition, but it might not be. Just because we share the same shadow behavior, you and me, or me and someone else, 1,000 different people in the room, doesn't mean that their shadow work is going to look the same, because your psyche is unique. The reason that something got repressed or disowned or projected into space which is away from my core identity, I took it outside of my ego, I projected it out into the shadow, is because of some unique pain. Something that split me, something that ruptured me, whatever it might have been. I can't give you the example for every single shadow behavior. I could give you a few examples for shadow entities. For example, if we're looking at the shadow entity of, what should we go with? We'll go with the lover. The lover archetype, both masculine and feminine. The shadow lover has a dark side, but also you have the golden shadow. The golden shadow of the lover is the incredible person in the bedroom, but also the wonderful committed partner. It's also the wonderful romantic parts. It's the long-term practical parts. It's all of the aspects of lover energy. There's creativity, there's play, but there's also commitment, there's depth, and there's nuance. Where are we going with that? I would need an entire 30-minute video to break down the shadow side of the lover, and again, I've done this inside of my course. I can't do it in a single video. I'm just trying to give you a theoretical framework. The territory itself, the whole territory of romantic relationships, you could say, for example, the shadow territory of romantic relationships leads into the shadow lover entities, and the shadow lover entities might have connections towards going on certain types of adult websites, being with the wrong kinds of partners, being avoidant within relationships, being overly possessive. Those are all the behaviors stemming off the lover, but the lover might not also be responsible because your avoidance could be due to the inner child, or maybe your particular controlling possessiveness could be due to the shadow side of the masculine king. I can't give you the examples. Maybe it's making it too complicated. Again, if you really want to go into archetypal theory, you can read Archetype by Anthony Stevens. I'm trying my absolute best to make a beginner video. You can tell that I generally try not to make beginner videos too often because this tends to happen. You can read these 2 beginner books if you really want to go deeper in your own time, or you can just join me over in the next video where we're going to be doing active imagination and a real walkthrough of how to speak with your shadow self and take this idea of the psychology of the entities, the territories, and behaviors, make it even more practical. I've linked it over here. Join me for active imagination and integrating your shadow self with a bit more of a practical result. I'll see you over there.